Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Today, we will be discussing how America came to be the imperialist, capitalist country it is today. This all came about after Britain and France fought in the Americas over the Ohio River Valley. What comes as a result of increasing, debilitating tensions between England and its western colonies will come to be known as the American Revolutionary War. In the fallout of the French and Indian War after the Proclamation Line of 1763 was established, British Prime Minister George Grenville thought of a way of generating revenue to pay for the war. This was in the form of the Stamp Act, in which he taxed the American colonists on all paper products. The resentment of British guards in Boston escalated after 7 British regulars opened fire into a crowd of unarmed colonists. 5 Americans were killed, and this began to be known as the Boston Massacre. News of the massacre spread quickly, and Americans from all over the colonies were up in arms and decided that British intervention in the American colonies was no longer needed. Being that the Royal Navy was the strongest naval force ever before seen in world's history, they with ease attacked and impressed American merchant ships, meaning they took the goods on the merchant ships and they forced the American sailors into the Royal Navy. This angered many Americans because of the fact that it showed that the British had little to no respect for the rights of American people and American trade. Being fed up with British tax and policy on colonial America, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded a British merchant ship being held in Boston Harbor. This began to be known as the Boston Tea Party, for they dumped over 1,000 pounds of British imported tea into the Boston Harbor. In response to colonial disobedience during the Boston Tea Party, Grenville and the rest of British Parliament decided to punish the colonists in the form of the Coercive Acts. This shut down the Boston Harbor, which essentially cut off trade to Boston, made the quartering of British soldiers mandatory within the city, and put even more stringent taxes on Boston and all American colonists. These acts in the colonists began to be known as the Intolerable Acts, for it was one of the last strands that kept America and Britain together, for the only thing left for Americans were war. A colonial response to the Intolerable or Coercive Acts was in form of the First Continental Congress, where 53 delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in order to discuss American retaliation or response to the Intolerable Acts. This response was in the form of a petition sent to King George III, and that leads right into our mystery document, where if I fail to guess the correct document, I will convert to the grossest of all imperialistic powers this world has ever seen.
This is the petition to King George III. We, your majesties, faithful subjects of the colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex, on Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, in behalf of ourselves and the inhabitants of those colonies, who have deputed us to represent them in General Congress, by this our humble petition beg leave to lay our grievances before the throne. Ian gave in the wrong answers and showed the Declaration of Independence, when in fact it is the 1774 petition to the king, and so Ian deserves a punishment.
In the last metaphorical straw for American colonists, British regulars and colonial militia fought in 2 Massachusetts towns, Lexington and Concord. In an attempt to seize colonial arms, British regulars opened fire on the militiamen, thus beginning the start of the American Revolutionary War.
So the War for American Independence started in the North. Boston was one of the only significant victories for George Washington and his troops, where cannon from Fort Ticonderoga assisted with the defense of the city. And on the other hand, you had New York, which was ultimately a huge successor for General Gates and the British, for they captured the city and forced George Washington to withstand huge losses in terms of men and supplies. So after the throttling in New York, and with winter approaching, Washington settled his troops in Valley Forge, New Jersey. During the ceasefire the Patriots were able to surprise Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton after he had been chased all throughout the Atlantic colonies. This victory provided as huge morale boost for the huge attributing factor to Washington's success was guerrilla-style warfare, due to the fact that the Americans had a smaller, less trained, and less equipped army. Defeating the British in open field was impossible. Because of this, they were feared to use uncertainty tactics in order to defeat a large, longer, powerful army. So, there was one bright spot for the Americans in an otherwise British-dominating northern campaign. The turning point of the war, Battle of Saratoga, the biggest win for Washington and his troops. This victory against British in open field proved to be enough for incentive for the French to join the war and be on the side of the American patriots. So after a successful northern campaign, the British would then turn their focus to the south. The fall of Savannah and Charleston. British domination led by General Cornwallis against a ragtag group of Americans in the south allowed for him to capture the two largest cities in the south. However, guerrilla-style tactics against the British proved to be the only thing that would bring American hopes alive, for defeating the British in open field proved to be a bloodbath. So, with all odds against, Washington from the north and Gates from the south, allied by the French Navy, were able to surround Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia, and force the British to surrender, thus ending the war and gaining independence from Britain. There, you heard it here first. History, let's go!
Tensions? What the fuck were they even gonna say? France and Native Americans for land promised to them by the Crown. After the Proclamation Line, the Stamp Act began to be known as the Boston Massacre. News of the massacre spread all throughout the colonies, and Americans from the men aboard and forced them into the Royal Navy. This began to be known schist.
For George Washington and his troops were cannon from Fort Trinidad. It was one of the only significant victories for George Washington and his troops, where cannon from Fort Ticonderoga.
Damn it, movement!
What is it?
You said it.
Washington and his troops, where cannon from Fort Trinidad. I don't know how to say it, man. Trinidad. So, there was one bright spot. The Americans in the war. Oh, I don't know what that says. So, there was one bright spot in the Americans. For the Americans! Were able to surround Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia, and force the British surrender.